Hello friends, I'm Professor Filip Kovacevic and this is the 18th edition of the Russian Newspapers Monitor. I hope you're doing well today. Thank you for your positive feedback and your comments. I encourage you to become a member of the Newsbud community and receive exclusive, high-quality content provided by the Newsbud team. Now, let's see what the major Russian newspapers decided to put on their front pages this week. Today, we'll begin with the front page of Kommersant, which is the main liberal newspaper in Russia, occasionally critical of the Russian government's economic and foreign policy. The edition for January 27, 2017. On the top of the front page, right below the newspaper heading, there is a photo of Victoria Nuland, the Obama administration Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, from the time when she delivered buns and cookies to the anti-government protesters in Kiev. The title states that Nuland has relinquished her position in the State Department. It states that according to the report of Associated Press, Victoria Nuland no longer works at the State Department. This, of course, could have been expected, considering that her aggressive anti-Russian positions are evidently not shared by the new Trump administration. So instead of becoming a Secretary of State, which was the position she would most likely have obtained under the President Hillary Clinton, Nuland is out of the job altogether. As the Romans would say, sit transit gloria mundi, or in English translation, thus passes the glory of the world. The Kommersant article consulted various experts, former diplomats, and political analysts about Nuland's legacy in Europe and Eurasia, and so let's examine what they said. It is interesting that nobody from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs would officially comment on Nuland's departure for this article. However, there is no doubt that they must have been very happy about it. The first expert that Kommersant consulted was Alexander Gabuev, who is an associate of the Moscow Western-funded Carnegie Center. According to him, starting in 2013, Nuland became the key US policy enforcer in Eastern Europe and Eurasia due to the fact that her immediate boss, John Kerry, was busy with the problems of the Middle East and that the President Barack Obama apparently lost interest in this area of the world after the failure of the so-called reset with Russia. Gabuev noted that the former US ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, was of great help to Nuland in making her influence felt in the post-Soviet political space. Gabuev said that Nuland used her influence to push for the Western and NATO incorporation of Ukraine, which she saw as the concluding act of the so-called Orange Revolution in 2004. Nuland advocated the imposition of harsh economic sanctions against Russia and even the delivery of offensive weapons to the Ukrainian army, which according to Gabuev was blocked by the President Obama. Nuland had a great deal of support from Daniel Fried, another vocal Russophobe in the top echelon of the State Department, who was in charge of the sanctions monitoring. Some diplomatic sources told Kommersant that Nuland had a habit of interrupting and correcting the Secretary Kerry during the meetings with Eastern European and Russian officials. The former US State Department official, who wanted to remain anonymous, told Kommersant that the kind of work Nuland performed during her time in charge of European and Eurasian affairs could best be called, quote, a catastrophe, end quote. According to him, there were no positive developments in any directions, but especially problematic was Nuland's close relationship with the Kiev government. The Kiev government was publicly praised by Nuland for its reforms and geopolitical friendliness, whereas its abuse of power and corruption was swept under the rug. In my opinion, this attitude by Nuland further complicated the conflict in Ukraine and made it more intractable and violent. Predictably, a source from the administration of the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko stated that the departure of Nuland was a bad news for Kiev. According to the article, this source emphasized that Nuland played a significant role in advancing the Ukrainian agenda in Washington, D.C. However, the source also added that even without Nuland, Kiev has a lot of supporters in the United States, including many in the US Congress. This, of course, is no secret for anybody. Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham are the top leaders of the pro-Ukrainian anti-Russian lobby on the US political scene. It is not surprising that Nuland is also being missed in Georgia, another former Soviet state that since the beginning of the last decade, when it was regime changed, has based its national politics on intense Russophobia, fed by NATO's geopolitical agenda. Tedo Djeparidze, the main foreign policy advisor to the Georgian Prime Minister, stated that Nuland helped a great deal in establishing a strategic partnership between Georgia and the United States. Just like any other NATO-engineered agent of influence, Djeparidze is intentionally silent on the fact that this partnership cost Georgia its territorial integrity, considering that its two rebellious regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, have been recognized by Russia as independent states. So long as Georgia does not radically modify its relations with Russia and gets rid of its Russophobia, these regions will remain outside its jurisdiction. On the other hand, if Georgians would elect a pro-Russian government, we would soon see the return of political stability in the region. Nuland's position in the State Department will be temporarily taken over by her deputy, John Heffern, the former US ambassador to Armenia. According to the article, those Armenian political figures and experts who met with Heffern during his mandate in the Armenian capital of Yerevan remember him for his balanced political positions. However, the way things stand, Heffern will most likely be in this position only for a relatively brief period of time until the new Trump administration decides on their own long-term appointee. In my opinion, when this article is taken as a whole, it appears that the journalists and editors of Kommersant also regret the departure of Victoria Nuland. Most people interviewed in this article come from countries who are direct geopolitical opponents of Russia, and in fact are openly Russophobic. This demonstrates that, unlike what you read about Russia in the US mainstream media, the Russian media scene is pluralistic, and there are major daily newspapers who openly criticize Putin's foreign policy and his geopolitical agenda. This means that Russia is not a dictatorship, and neither is Putin a dictator. Putin is a strong leader in line with the Russian tradition of the strong executive with populist tendencies. The fact that this tradition is very different from the one enshrined in the US Constitution does not mean that the imposition of the US political system in Russia would lead to more political stability and economic prosperity. In fact, the early 1990s in Russia proved the exact opposite. The weak state in Russia does not mean democracy, but results in social turbulence and economic chaos. Now, let's go to Novaya Gazeta, which is a Western-funded liberal newspaper, very critical of Putin's decisions and policies. The edition for January 27, 2017. On the bottom of the front page, there is a heading for an article about the recent partial privatization of the Russian state-owned oil company Rosneft, which asks a question. Was the privatization of the Rosneft helped due to the national interest? The article reports that even though more than a month has passed since the selling of 19.5% of Rosneft to the Swiss company Glencore and the Qatari investment fund QIA, the key details of the privatization remain secret. According to the article, the public is still not informed who really owns this large chunk of the Russian biggest oil company. As a result, there are many rumors alleging grand-scale corruption and the existence of hidden beneficiaries. According to the article, not even the basic things about the sale are known. For instance, who owns the shares? Who will get the voting rights based on the purchase? Whose money was transferred into the Russian government budget? And what role in the transaction was played by the Russian state bank VTB? The article claims that such secrecy is not accidental. In other words, the government is trying to hide something, according to the article. According to the political analyst Dmitry Oreshkin, the partial privatization of Rosneft was an important PR operation for the government, which was designed to demonstrate to the domestic audience that the government was highly effective in attracting foreign investment, even under the stringent anti-Russian economic sanctions imposed by the EU and the United States. In addition, Sergei Romanchuk, who is a banking analyst, claims that this was not a genuine privatization based on international investment, but essentially a covert way of infusing a large sum of money into the Russian budget from the Russian state banks through the use of a Singapore offshore company. The whole operation could be a very complex money laundering scheme in which the shares went from the Russian government to certain Russian private business circles linked to the Kremlin. The Rus energy company partner Mikhail Krutikhin further claimed that one of the companies publicly mentioned as the co-investor, the Swiss company Glencore, already said that it owned only 0.54% of the shares, while the other, the Qatar fund, never revealed how much it paid and how much it owns. In other words, it cannot be determined with any certainty who really owns the shares worth billions of dollars. On the other hand, the new Russian Minister for Economic Development, Maxim Oreshkin, claimed during the recent World Economic Forum in Davos that the privatization of Rosneft was very successful and that it was a sign that international investors were still very interested in investing in Russia. That is the reason why some experts, such as Romanchuk, put forward the PR motive as one of the key factors for the privatization. According to both Romanchuk and Krutikhin, this privatization will not increase the confidence of international investors. They claim that no new big investment projects will follow, and that the Russian government's PR effort was unsuccessful outside the borders of Russia. The question also remains as to the extent of the involvement of the Russian President Vladimir Putin in the privatization deal. It is well known, for instance, that Igor Sechin, the executive chairman of Rosneft and a former deputy prime minister, is Putin's long-term political associate, whom many considered Putin's de facto deputy. In my opinion, the privatization deal is also enigmatic from the geopolitical point of view, especially concerning the involvement of the Qatari government. It is not a secret that Qatar, together with Saudi Arabia, was one of the biggest supporters of the extremist anti-Assad opposition in Syria. And so here we have a paradox. At the same time that the Russian military is fighting against the Qatari-funded militants in Syria, the Russian government sells almost 20% of one of its crown jewel companies to Qatar. This hardly makes any geopolitical sense unless, of course, this was a kind of the bribery for Qatar to get out of Syria and allow the ceasefire to take place and the peace negotiations to begin. As a result, the pressure on the Russian military is significantly reduced, as well as the amount of money that the Russian government has to spend on Syria. However, if this was the case, then Russia was really hard-pressed to wind down its Syrian military intervention as soon as possible. But then again, as this article claims, perhaps the true involvement of the Qataris in this privatization was minimal, and the essence of the whole thing was to transfer yet another state-owned resource into the private hands of the Putin-sponsored oligarchy. Now, let's take a look at the front page of Izvestia, a moderate pro-government newspaper, the edition for January 30th, 2017. On the front page, under the title, "In a Positive Key," there are two big color photographs of the US President Donald Trump and the Russian President Vladimir Putin holding phone receivers and presumably talking to each other. Below the photographs, there is a commentary which states, "In the course of the conversation, the two leaders agreed to establish regular personal contact." The article reports that the US press claimed that, based on the results of the first official phone conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin since Trump's inauguration on January 20th, Trump, quote, "opened a new era in the relations between the two countries," end quote. According to the article, the conversation lasted for about an hour and was positively evaluated by both the Kremlin and the White House. The Kremlin also stated that there was work underway to determine the possible dates and places for a meeting between Putin and Trump. The article reports that Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, said to Izvestia that it was still not clear where and when the meeting would take place. According to the article, the Kremlin statement also stressed that Trump and Putin discussed a whole series of current international issues, including international terrorism, the Middle East conflicts, the Iranian nuclear program, the Korean Peninsula, and the Ukrainian conflict. Importantly, the statement mentioned that the two presidents agreed to begin a joint effort against ISIS and other terrorist groups in Syria. And indeed, according to the article, immediately after the conversation, Trump gave an order to the Pentagon to strengthen the anti-ISIS collaboration with Russia. The head of the International Affairs Committee in the lower house of the Russian parliament, the State Duma, Leonid Slutsky, stated for Izvestia that the immediate results of the conversation were encouraging. He said that the US-Russian cooperation against terrorists in Syria represented a significant positive change from the policies of the previous US presidential administration, which appeared to protect certain terrorist groups. This opinion was also shared by Alexei Pushkov, a member of the Defense and Security Committee in the upper house of the Russian parliament, the Federation Council. The article notes that during the conversation, Trump stated that he wished happiness and flourishing to the Russian people. Putin reciprocated by emphasizing that Russia has supported the United States many times in the 200 years of diplomatic relations and was the US ally in both world wars. The economic side of the US-Russia relations was also discussed. While the anti-Russian sanctions are not mentioned in the Kremlin's official statement, the emphasis is put on the strengthening of the relations between the business circles of the two countries. In my opinion, this is a code phrase for finding alternative ways to diminish the impact of the US sanctions until they could be fully lifted. Both Trump and Putin know that there is a great deal of opposition in the US Congress to the lifting of sanctions, thanks to the Ukrainian and anti-Putin Russian billionaires lobbying the members of Congress. And so other ways have to be devised to alleviate the pressure on the Russian economy. We will no doubt hear more about this approach in the coming months. The content of the Trump-Putin phone conversation signals an important step toward the geopolitical détente between two strongest nuclear powers in the world. Although I have no doubt that it is all still very fragile, and many powerful political forces will do everything to stir up and amplify the animosities again. One of the trigger points for this may be the situation in the Donbass, which has seen the exponential increase in fighting in recent days. The NATO-mentored Ukrainian army and special forces might actually try to invade the rebellious provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk, though this would be a suicidal, self-destructive act. It would likely push Russia into the situation where it could not but openly intervene militarily. Now, let's look at the front page of Nezavisimaya Gazeta, the middle-of-the-road newspaper, the edition for January 31st, 2017. At the bottom of the front page, there is an article referring to the Russian military base in Kyrgyzstan, in the town of Kant. The title is, "The air base in Kant will provide the security of Kyrgyzstan." The subtitle explains that the Russian lease on the base and other military objects in Kyrgyzstan has been extended for another 15 years. The article reports that there are 4 Russian military objects in Kyrgyzstan: the airbase, the experimental military base, the military communication center, and the seismic control center. Under a new agreement between the Russian and the Kyrgyz governments, all of them are put under a single command and are operated under the similar guidelines. In the past, there were some controversies about the Russian government payments for having its military forces in Kyrgyzstan, raised by some Kyrgyz opposition politicians. According to the article, the new agreement resolves this issue as well. The Russian government will pay $4.5 million for annual lease of the experimental military base and the military communication center, while the airbase and the seismic control center will be based in Kyrgyzstan without charge. The Seismic Control Center is under obligation to pass on its information to the Kyrgyz-owned Seismological Institute free of charge. And the Russians won't have to pay for the airbase, because the airbase is considered a component of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and its purpose is to provide external security to Kyrgyzstan. The Russian military planes and helicopters based in the airbase are a part of the Collective Security Treaty Organization's Rapid Reaction Force. This means that the Russian-controlled CSTO has followed NATO in establishing rapid military intervention units. The Russian military personnel and their families in the airbase have diplomatic immunity, which means that they cannot be prosecuted by the Kyrgyz authorities. The authorities also cannot enter the premises of the base without the permission of the Russian commander. In my opinion, such a generous deal by the Kyrgyz government shows to what extent they have become very close Russian ally in the last several years. The article also reports that the Russians are helping the Kyrgyz restart their own once strong military industrial complex. The ammunition factory in Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, is back in business and is apparently booming. There's also some talk about the reopening of the ex-Soviet torpedo factory. But so far, neither the Kyrgyz nor the Russian governments invested the necessary funds for doing that. In addition, the article recalls that during much of the last decade, the United States also had an airbase in Kyrgyzstan, the Manas airbase. However, the Kyrgyz government, very likely acting under the advice of the Russian government, decided not to extend the lease to the US military, and the base was closed in 2014. The closure of the Manas military base is a clear sign that the US has lost the influence in Central Asia that it had after the breakup of the Soviet Union. It also shows the defeat of the US Eurasian strategy developed by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his geopolitical bestseller, The Grand Chessboard, published exactly 20 years ago. At this time, 20 years later, most former Soviet republics in Central Asia are firmly back under the Russian supervision. This fact obviously has serious geopolitical implications for the energy and mineral resource wealth of Central Asia. Unless the Western oil and gas companies begin cooperating again with the Russian government, they will find themselves excluded from some very profitable long-term business ventures. Lastly today, we'll go back to the front page of Izvestia, but this time we'll look at the edition for February 1st, 2017. At the bottom of the front page, there is an article with the title, Donbass Fights Against the Ukrainian Saboteurs. The subtitle explains that the leadership of the two self-proclaimed Donbass republics believes that the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko provoked the current increase in violence in order to stay in power. Right below the title, there is a photograph of an emergency worker helping an injured miner, and the commentary reads, more than 200 miners found themselves cut off underground after the artillery attack by the Ukrainian army. The article reports that just a few days before the scheduled meeting of the Minsk contact group, the Kiev government intentionally attacked the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. According to the article, the Ukrainian army tried to break through the defense lines in the region of Avdiivka using heavy artillery. In addition, numerous groups of saboteurs have been trying to infiltrate deep into the territories of the two republics and create social disorder and panic. The article reports that Dmitry Peskov, the Russian President Putin's press secretary, stated that the Kremlin was very concerned about recent developments in the Donbass. He said that the Russian side possessed credible evidence that it was the Kiev forces which brutally destroyed the fragile ceasefire. In addition, Peskov regretted the fact that Poroshenko turned his back on the Minsk Accords, which, according to Peskov, represent the only way to resolve the Ukrainian conflict. According to Denis Pushilin, the president of the People's Council of the Donetsk People's Republic, the Kiev government is using all means at its disposal to provoke the self-proclaimed republics to react militarily and then accuse them of breaking the Minsk Accords. Pushilin stated that they were well aware of this covert plan and that they would not allow themselves to be drawn into severe military escalation. He also said that the Kiev government was sending dozens of saboteurs to penetrate the Donbass, and that, considering that these individuals speak the same language as the local population, they are very difficult to detect on time before they commit acts of destruction and terrorism. According to Pushilin, the action of the Kiev government and the President Poroshenko show that he is panicking because he knows that he is losing the international support he had previously. His European allies, France and Germany, are busy with their internal political issues in light of the coming elections, and the new Trump administration seems interested in improving the relations with Russia. This means that Poroshenko is ready to employ desperate measures to get the European and US public opinion on his side, including sacrificing many young lives of the Ukrainian army recruits, as well as of the civilian population in the Donbass. Miroslav Rudenko, the deputy of the People's Council in Donetsk, agreed with Pushilin. He stated that it was cynical from Poroshenko to take with him on a European tour the photographs of the funerals of the Ukrainian army soldiers in order to get European sympathy and support, at the same time that the Ukrainian army under his command was destroying schools and hospitals in the Donbass, killing innocent civilians, elderly, women, and children. It is clear that the geopolitical context in Eastern Europe is changing, and that NATO-supported aggressive activities against Russia are losing their support in Western Europe. The election of the new French president, especially in the case of the victory of Marine Le Pen, the leader of the right-wing Front National, would put an end to NATO's plans for further expansion in the East, and in fact is likely to lead to NATO's gradual but inevitable disintegration. The Kiev government knows this and sees its only chance for survival in provoking Russia to openly enter the conflict in Ukraine by massively attacking and perhaps even invading the Donbass. However, I doubt that the Ukrainian public opinion is in favor of such an exponential and, as I said previously, suicidal military escalation. In other words, Poroshenko's strategizing has hit a wall, and we are likely, in my opinion, we are likely seeing the last months of his presidency. There is no doubt that Ukraine is in for even wider political and social turbulences with unpredictable and dangerous results. Dear friends, that's all for today. Thank you for watching. Please become a member of the Newsbud community. Also, be cool and stay cool until the next edition of the Russian newspaper's Monitor.
For just a small subscription fee, you can become a member of the Newsbud community and help keep this website running. Your subscription will provide you with full community access to exclusive content, including videos and articles from Newsbud's team of experts and analysts, as well as a members-only monthly newsletter from Newsbud's founder, Sibel Edmonds. Sign up today for full access at newsbud.com.